Kelly? Pretty good. That's good. Well, are you ready for today's discussion? Yeah, I think so. Well, today we're going to be talking about difficult discussions. And those discussions that, you know, create anxiety in us, make us feel uncomfortable. Oh yeah, those. Hey. Yeah, Beaky? Why are your lips moving when I'm talking? Like, aren't you supposed to be listening? Well, yeah, Beaky, is you know that active listening is an important part of it, but well, well, how come? See, there you go again. Your lips are moving. Well, yeah, Beaky, my lips are moving. I mean, well, take a look down below. What the? Your hands all the way up my. Okay, well, that didn't quite go like I had expected this to start. So, today we're going to be talking about difficult discussions, and as you can see, that one didn't quite go as I had expected it. So let's maybe take a little bit of a deeper dive into these difficult discussions and see maybe where I went wrong. Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Christofferson, and I am going to be spending the next little while talking to you about difficult discussions. Now, difficult discussions are something that happen every day. As you know, as human beings, we interact with lots of different people, and as you saw in that little introduction that I did, we can even have difficult discussions with people that who are our friends, who are in our family, people that we work with, strangers that we meet. You know, difficult discussions are going to happen all around us. And so today I'm going to take a little bit of a exploration of difficult discussions and kind of go through some of the things to look for as you're approaching a difficult discussion, and some of the things that you can do as a teacher, an administrator, maybe even as a parent or somebody who's in a relationship. I'm going to focus mostly on school and what people can do at school when they're coming into a difficult discussion or they happen upon a difficult discussion. So where did this come from? Well, last January during SaskEd Chat, and I am the creator and moderator of SaskEd Chat, we had a discussion about difficult discussions. We had various people chime in, and we went through several different questions that we explored when it came to discussions. So I'm just going to kind of go through those discussions, some of the responses that were given. Then I'm going to delve into a more in-depth look at difficult discussions, especially the two types of difficult discussions that we have, specifically in education. Those two types of difficult discussions have a little bit different format to them, and how we can approach each one just a little bit more differently. The big thing with difficult discussions is that we want to approach difficult discussions from a position of empathy. Now, we've heard a lot about mindfulness, we've heard a lot about social emotional learning, dealing with students with trauma, dealing with parents and other colleagues and people around us who are having difficulty with what's going on. I mean, let's face it, the pandemic and the things that we've been through in the last almost year have been difficult. And they have changed the way that we interact, they have changed the way that we have discussions, they have changed what we do when we have interactions with people. One of the things that's happened is we don't have the face-to-face interactions that we normally would have. our students are not having those face-to-face interactions that they normally have. And that is creating situations in which difficult discussions are happening as we try and help various people, especially as educators, work through this difficult time. You notice I'm using the word difficult a lot, and that's because at the end of this, I want you to understand that even though we have difficult discussions, that there is a way out, that there is some ways that we can do different things so that our difficult discussions turn into positive discussions, that these discussions will eventually, even though they are hard to have, we move towards looking for a positive solution. So, Saskatchewan, the very first question we asked was, what would you describe as a difficult discussion? And our responses, there were many very different responses. A lot of them had to do with making people uncomfortable. So these discussions were about, when people feel uncomfortable with the discussion, controversial topics, things that people don't really want to discuss, topics people don't like to discuss, things like that. Now, there were a couple of responses that I think take us in a slightly different direction, and something that we have to really look at. The one is that difficult discussions are an opportunity for growth, and it's an opportunity for those involved to learn something new and to develop themselves. And this is an important thing because as a person who's involved in a difficult discussion, approaching it with that mindset allows for us to take maybe a different approach to what we're doing, starting with empathy and then moving forward. So instead of being apprehensive, instead of being worried about what's going to happen, I mean, not that those aren't perfectly normal reactions, but usually when we're involved in a difficult discussion, we have an opportunity to make a decision about how we're going to approach that discussion. A little later on, we're going to talk about the two types of difficult discussions that we have and how those two different types of difficult discussions often lead us to have very different kinds of interactions with people. The other one is, how do we approach these difficult discussions? As one of the participants indicated, wasn't so much how we feel, but how is the other person going to feel? How is the other person going to perceive what is happening? And as we move forward, when we start having discussions with people and having conversations, by being empathetic and starting from that position, we can extend and look at it as a way to help both of us. And knowing that as we enter these discussions, that there's a good possibility that the person that we're going to be having a discussion with may in fact be apprehensive about what's going to happen. If you look at it in a school context from a teacher's perspective or an administrator's perspective, a lot of the conversations that you're going to have are with people, especially if they're going to be difficult, about topics that make them uncomfortable. Topics or things that have happened where people's emotions are already on guard, that we've entered that situation and we've stepped into this discussion and there's already emotional things happening. Our second question dealt with how do people handle difficult discussions. So the first one is, that whole idea of what is a difficult discussion. Second question dealt with how do people handle difficult discussions, and the whole idea is that we have basically when we enter those discussions that we have the fight or flight response, and that is very common where we get very defensive. We look at ways that we can defend ourselves, or we can get out of the situation, we can end this conversation and move away. or we can win. Right? We're in that position where we're gonna have this conversation, and we're gonna prove our point. We're gonna supply the facts, and we're gonna lay it out for other people, and they're gonna see it our way. Unfortunately, the research shows us that when we approach things that way, and the person isn't ready to listen, that they are in a fight or flight situation, that doubling down with the facts is in fact going to make them even more unwilling to listen. And it seems that research has shown that people who, when we're in that situation, they are not ready to listen to facts, they are ready to listen, and what ends up happening is, as you present the facts, they aren't really paying attention because how they're feeling is attacked. They're feeling as if they're not being heard, that you're presenting the facts, and this has now become a win-lose situation for them. And in those situations, the important thing to do is, instead of continuing on that route, is to back up. And as I spoke before, the whole idea of being mindful of what's happening, of being aware of the social emotion of the individual that's involved, we have to take those into consideration. And if we're really focused on saving that relationship, and that should be when we enter a discussion, our primary concern is to save that relationship, is to foster it and to make it stronger. In order to do that, presenting facts is not going to get us to the point where we are. I mean, in my little introduction, I pointed the fact out to Beaky that he's like look down, right? And that's a fact. He's a puppet. And he didn't react. Now, we're not going to have that, but people are going to be, if we do that, they become angry, displeased, they're upset, and they aren't ready to listen. They are not ready to be involved in a discussion in which we can move forward. So as you probably are aware, in the limbic system, the amygdala is that part of the brain that gives us the fight or flight. It kind of gets our emotions going. That's where fear, anger, and those kind of things are situated. And once that kicks in, we're not ready to have conversations. And in a lot of cases, when we have fear or anger, the whole logical part of our brain is short-circuited, and we get into those confrontation moments. And in order for us to be able to step back and allow our minds to be able to deal with the situation, to allow our brains time to be able to step back and to then move on into the logical processing part of the brain, we need to be able to work through that. And one of the things that ends up happening is that if we don't provide time for the other person or even ourselves to have those moments, the conversation doesn't move forward in a way that is usually productive. So if our main goal is to save those relationships, is to foster relationships and build them, which in schools is the foundation of what we do with our students, with our parents, with colleagues, is to have those relationships and build them, to lift each other up so that we can be better tomorrow than we were today, and in order to do that, to help one another. But sometimes we have to have difficult discussions. Sometimes we have to have conversations that are not easy. And that's okay. In fact, that's good. It is in those conversations, those difficult conversations, that we learn. It is in conversations, as we know that students, that whole idea of learning, and Vygotsky in the zone of proximal development talks about, scaffolding, where there's that dissonance. Dissonance helps us to learn. It makes us reflect. It helps us to find connections. It helps us to do all kinds of things when it comes to learning. We need to be able to have a chance to reflect. We need to have times to have conversations. We need to get feedback. All those things are important in growth and in learning. And in a very similar way, when we're having conversations that are difficult, we need to be able to have time to be able to process. We need to know that as part of the conversation, people are listening to us. We need to know that how we feel and the things that we're experiencing right now are okay, and that they're validated by the person that is involved with us or the other people in the conversation. So all these things have to need to take place, and in order to move past that fight, flight, or we get that argument point where we get into those win-lose situations. And although it's important to have a win-win situation, sometimes we have to really look at, before we're looking at win-win, we're looking at fostering and developing those relationships. And those relationships are foundational and key to what we're going to do going forward. So the third question that we looked at was some ways that people handle difficult discussions. And this is where we come into the two different types of difficult discussions that most educators are involved in. The first type is a planned difficult discussion. And in those discussions, we plan to have them. We set up an appointment or we have a conversation with somebody, and we plan to have that conversation. So whether it's with a student, whether it's with a parent, whether it's with another colleague, whether it's with an administrator, we're planning those discussions. And we take time to plan that difficult discussion, right? We know that we have to have it. Now there are some positive things to being able to plan that discussion, and there's some things that we need to be aware of. The first is that when we're going to plan to have a difficult discussion, we have to take into account when we're going to approach that specific point in time. One of the things that research has pointed out to us is that if you say to somebody, I need to have a talk with you about a specific discussion, let's have a discussion tomorrow, that will create in the other person usually all kinds of stress. The unknown is so difficult for people to handle. So when you approach to have a difficult discussion, leading into it, one of the first things that you need to do is plan to approach the subject when, if necessary, you can have that discussion fairly shortly. The reason for that is that not a lot of people like to have that prolonged time. It creates the anxiety. Secondly, in that moment in time, if it's important to address the situation, it might be important to address it now. It can't wait. And allowing it to wait actually creates yet more difficulties. So if it is a discussion that can happen later on, it is extremely important that when you approach the person, you identify what you want to have in the discussion, you identify if there are concerns, and you provide the person an opportunity to actually have input when that conversation is going to happen. So that the individual does not feel like it is a one-way street. I need to have this discussion with you. Let's have it tomorrow. Doesn't really, that's creating anxiety. I need to have this discussion tomorrow. This is what it's about. And this is what we're going to go through. I'll see you at 8:30. Really doesn't give that person any input. They're being called in. Okay? This is especially true when dealing with colleagues or parents. That providing people with options, and doesn't always happen. right? There are some times when when we know that time limits and time factors come into play, and we can't always do that, and we have to be upfront about that. I think one of the biggest things with having difficult discussions is providing people with the whole idea, the context of what we're going to have in this difficult discussion, is treating people how we want to be treated. And I know for myself, having had several difficult discussions, I know when people, especially supervisors, have come to me and said, you know, we need to have a discussion. I'll talk to you tomorrow. I didn't sleep that night, like, right? And I was miserable, and it affected relationships with my family. I mean, if you ask my wife, please don't do that. But if you were to ask my wife, she would tell you that, yeah, those discussions are tough. And it's not just with outside of work. I mean, it's in our families too. I mean, have you ever said to your spouse, oh, we'll talk about that later? And your spouse is going like, what? Or your child? Those kind of things create anxiety in people. And being aware of that can really help us to reduce the anxiety and to approach the subject from a fostering relationships point of view, where we're going to have a conversation, even though we know it's going to be difficult. We're working on fostering that relationship, building it up, increasing the bucket, filling the bucket of each other in various discussions that are had. We want to put things into other people's buckets. And so taking that time to explain to that other person, hey, I really want to have a discussion with you tomorrow about this. I know that you're busy. Is there a time that would be best to have this discussion? Approach the subject, be specific, and give them some options. After our first kind of discussion, which is the planned discussion, we have those discussions which are unplanned, which I refer to as stepping into difficult discussions. They're the ones that you step into when you really don't expect it. They're the ones where you have a confrontation with a student. They're the ones that you have when you have a confrontation with a parent that you weren't aware of. They're the ones where you come across two students having a dispute, or something's going on, or you say something. These difficult discussions, these ones that we step into, especially as educators, happen all the time. And these ones that we step into are sometimes the most difficult. Usually, they become difficult, and we end up going in different directions, mostly because we don't step back and take just a moment. We want to solve the situation so we can move on and keep going with our agenda. Dispute in the playground, student not doing something, student, whatever the situation. There's various things happening, and we don't take that time to step back, pause, and then move forward. We're in the need to solve the problem and move on. And sometimes that works, right? You have a situation, we have two students having something going on, or you need a student to quit doing what they're doing, or, right? Those are difficult discussions. I mean, we don't maybe classify them as, but there are people that are reacting, and we're having an interaction with another person. It's when those discussions go to the next level, right? Where you ask the student to please sit down and be quiet, and they don't. Or they're on the playground and you have two students who get in a confrontation themselves. Or the list goes on. And this is where the things I talked about earlier, and the whole idea that we need to pause. We need to take a moment And we need to step back, and we need to spend some time allowing ourselves to focus on relationship. Sometimes we can just say, you need to stop doing that. Move on. Doesn't always work. And what ends up happening is that you get into a fight or flight situation where you have, people react. And you don't expect it. Right? I don't know if any of you have ever experienced this as a parent, but your child, small child, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 5-year-old, teenager, you say something to them which you would consider to be a reasonable request. Can you please hang up your jacket? Simple request. Oh my goodness. What happens next is the beginning of a 45 to 3-hour session on various things. You weren't expecting it. You were not expecting that to happen. And when we have that happen, a lot of the time, even as a parent, I've done this. I've reacted in a way that escalated, that took the conversation, discussion from here to here and created a conflict. A conflict that then required all kinds of other things to happen. Now, I don't always do this, but it's something that I have learned. And having made lots of mistakes, especially as a parent, when getting into those type of discussions. But I've also made it a lot of those mistakes as a teacher and as an administrator. And, reflecting on them and learning from them is really important. And so that whole idea that when that happens, we need to be able to not react. We need to step back. And we need to identify that now we have a situation that we didn't expect, and we need to focus on relationship. And it is hard. And we don't always do it because we're human. We don't always make that right choice. And that's just part of being a human being. And it's okay. And that's the part that we need to come to, that it's okay because we now have an ability to go back and help build that relationship. Because we can explain where we've come from. We can explain that there is two people in this relationship, and we did not act correctly, but this is where we were coming from. We don't have to lay out the facts. We don't have to lay out all those things, but, I'm really sorry. I acted in a way that really didn't help the situation. And I would like to move forward. I would like to do and have a conversation with you so that we can move forward. Can go a long way in building that relationship. But we have to first be willing to say that, yeah, I didn't hold up my end of that difficult discussion. Now there are some people I know, and there's a couple people I know that are very intuitively able, that when those conversations come along, to move into a very empathetic response, and are able to move forward in having a discussion in which they start from a place of empathy. I am not one of those people. I sometimes have a really hard time with that. And so it has become really important for me to recognize this is a situation. And even though it startled me, I have to do something because moving forward, this is going to be really important. So things like, I think we need to talk about this, but I'm going to give us both a minute to just calm down. Right? Breathe. Take a moment just to be quiet. And there's lots of circumstances where you can say to the individual, I think we need to have a discussion about this, but before we do, why don't you go get a drink of water? Saying that to a student can go a long way. I would have situations, especially as an administrator, where things would be brought to me, there'd be things going on, and sometimes it seemed that you went from one thing to another, to another, to another, and it didn't stop. And so you have that residue that flows from one incident to another. If you don't take time to allow yourself to let go, to calm yourself down, that residue soon builds up, right? And it flows into other conversations you start having. You may not have it with another student, but it may come as a colleague or with your family. So it's taking those moments to step back. I had a superintendent who once advised me that, before you jump from A to B to C or conversation to difficulty, right? Sometimes it seems like you're putting fires out all day, is to, before you go from one to another, take a moment for yourself, visualize yourself being in a place that allows you to calm down. It's like a lake. Visualizing that lake glass smooth. Or for me, it's like, being in camping and sitting outside, and it's just all I can hear is the leaves and see the sun calming me right down. And that's important. And there'll be people that will, those kind of things. Yeah, I was like that too, right? Those are not necessarily tools that we have used because they weren't part of the discussions we had. And yet, especially now, especially during this time when we have high levels of stress, high levels of anxiety, where we have people who are under all kinds of stress for a variety of reasons, those soft skills, though, that whole idea of empathy, being able to reach out, to build relationships are vital, especially as leaders. Teachers are leaders with their students and in the school and with parents sometimes. Leaders, principals are leaders with their teachers. And we can't always do it. The reality is that a lot of us are tired. We're fatigued. That whole idea of empathy fatigue, where we've been asked to do this again and again and again, is real. It's not something that is made up. That we are able to care, but we're finding it just a little bit more difficult. And that's something that we need to be aware of, especially as professionals who care. We care for our students, we care for our colleagues, we care for our families. And that caring does take an emotional toll on all of us. And having difficult discussions dips further into that reserve that for many of us is very low. So, I guess with that, the whole idea of this discussion, or the whole idea of this presentation, was that the whole idea that difficult discussions are something that we have regularly. We plan them, or we don't plan them. The ones that we plan, we can do some things with. We can have things in order. We can think about what we want to say. We can think about how our body language is. We can think about how we're going to present ourselves. But then when we get in the moment, we have to be willing to not think about necessarily ourselves, but think about the other person. And how is this conversation I'm having with this other person going to make them feel? When we're having those discussions where we step into them, we're kind of in the same position that we have to start with. We're going to foster relationships here. We're going to build relationships, and we're going to move forward. Yes, these discussions are difficult. They ask us to do sometimes to reconsider our points of view. They ask us to do things that we didn't think we were going to have to do that day. And they aren't always conflicts. I think a lot of us think of difficult discussions as being conflicts, and that's not true. A lot of difficult discussions aren't conflicts. They're topics that come to us because of the fact that we notice something. We ask a question. We are concerned. And what ends up coming from that can lead to a difficult discussion. You are then in a situation where you're asked to build a relationship, foster what's happening between you. Having had, as an administrator and as a teacher, several of those conversations over my career where you have a student disclose something to you, where you have a parent come in and you expect to have a discussion about what's happening in school and something else happens, where you have somebody that you work with come and talk to you about something that you didn't expect, where you have somebody ask you for advice, or you have somebody that you know and they're looking for guidance. Yes, those can be very empowering discussions, but they're also difficult. And so approaching those with the whole idea that you want to build and you want to help those people. So just a couple things to think about as you approach those discussions. One is to give yourself a moment to get past your emotional response so that you can enter that discussion and you can be looking for solutions that are mutual. Doesn't always happen, but that's what we hope. The second thing is to allow the other person to speak and then invite them to elaborate. That doesn't always happen, and it really shows active listening. I'm listening to you, and now I need you to tell me more. Once they do that, once you provide that, allowing for times of quiet in those conversations, to breathe, to just have those moments. I guess another thing, a fourth part of this whole difficult discussion part, is to, in a situation of active listening, to provide what you've heard and then ask, what do we want to do? What is it that we're seeking here? Get input. We want a solution. Okay, now how are we going to move forward? Instead of fight or flight, win, right? We're looking for fostering a mutual or a solution. I know, sometimes it doesn't always happen. Sometimes people are going to leave and they're not going to be happy with the solution that we come up with. And unfortunately, that does happen. Unfortunately, people's feelings get hurt, or they're not ready to move out of the fight or flight. And sometimes you have to, if you recognize that, be very tactful in saying, I don't think we're quite ready to have this discussion, that there's still a big divide between us. And I know as an administrator, I've had to have those conversations with parents that, I think we need to take a break here and we need to step back because we're not at that point where we can come up with a solution. Especially given the fact, and I mean, say that you're still yelling at me, right? We've provided opportunity and still, we need to take a break. We need to step back and step out so that we can approach this maybe later so that we can come up with a solution. So, difficult discussions. They happen all the time. They happen in our families. They happen between colleagues. They happen in our schools, in our classrooms, in our hallways, on our playgrounds. And not all our discussions are difficult. Not all of our discussions lead to that. But there are those that do. I hope that you found this helpful. I hope you found that this whole discussion about difficult discussions has given you some tools to use, given you some idea of how to approach a difficult discussion. If you have any questions or you would like some information about difficult discussions, you can reach out to me. Here's my email address. You can also get a hold of me on Twitter and I am on LinkedIn. You can find me there. And you can just find me. I work with the Regina Catholic School Division. I'm an online teacher, so you can get a hold of me there. I wish you all the best for the rest of the day. I hope you enjoy the rest of your presentations. I wish you all to have a great day. And remember, every day is a PD day. Thank you for taking your time and being with me today.